Hi there. Welcome to Baden Hill Academy, and we are continuing our build-up about the build-up to World War I. This is the Trenches unit, and this is the second installment. And during this video, I want to try and flesh out a little bit how Germany became so powerful. Now, in the last video, we talked a little bit about the idea that Prussia was rising and that one of the reasons that it gained its strength was because of its willingness to modernize and because of its resources, because it took over certain resources from the Napoleonic Wars. And so Prussia gained from the Congress of Vienna, and it also changed considerably in 1848. There was a revolution in Germany at that time, but it was put down, and I guess that gave confidence to the rulers. They knew that they had to figure out this whole revolution thing. They knew that they couldn't just demand that everybody obey them, but it's a little bit of a game. They allowed some democratic institutions, but they maintained a monarchy and even an empire. And so you have the emperor of the new country of Germany, which we'll talk about during this unit. So this video is called Deep-Seated Differences. And what I'm referring to, first of all, if it's deep-seated, that means it sits deep. It's deep down in the identity of certain groups of people, that they are different from other groups of people. This is human sinfulness, right? It's the fact that we can't seem to get along no matter what is happening. So even though Napoleon had been put down, the continent couldn't come together and say, now we know what we need to do. Same thing after the revolutions of 1848. Even though the people were clearly wanting change, the countries weren't willing to give up their power. The kings and the nobles weren't willing to give up the power that they had. And so we enter a period where you have different people groups coming together as nations against other nations. You also have the formation of alliances, and we will talk about that as well. But Prussia is the main player, and they are growing in strength. Remember that Prussia was the heir to what Germans called the First Reich. That means the Holy Roman Empire, established in, we'll say, 800 by Charlemagne when he was crowned by the Pope as the Emperor of the Franks. And that became the Holy Roman Empire. And that lasted all the way through the Middle Ages and even through the Renaissance. So Martin Luther actually had to go before the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. So it still existed even at that time. Eventually it fell apart. So the First Reich, Reich meaning kingdom, that ceased to be. And so that leaves us with the Second Reich. The Second Reich. That is the new Germany that is going to form. In 1866, an important war took place, and it had to do with the unification, not of Germany, but of Italy. In Italy, just like in Germany, people were wanting to join together. People who spoke the same language, had the same culture. They wanted to be a nation. And in Italy, the territory that had been controlled by Italians and Italian-speaking peoples, it actually was 9 different states that weren't together. And basically you had different countries, powers from Europe, controlling parts of Italy. In the south, it was controlled by the Spanish. In the north, it was controlled by the Austrians. And then you had what were called the Papal States. The Papal States refers to the Pope's control. The Pope is in Rome, but during the Middle Ages and on into the Renaissance, the Pope actually had a lot of political power. He was basically an emperor of his own. So you have three men in Italy who want to have independence, first of all, from all those other European powers, but also they want to have unity among the whole boot of Italy. And so those three men are Mazzini, who was basically a revolutionary and wanted democracy. He wanted a federal republic, which is, again, that should sound kind of familiar. The federal system means you have these states and they have some freedom to be themselves and govern themselves, but they also are joined together. So it's not just separate countries. They're actually joined together, and we call that a federation, a federal system. And a republic means that people actually get to vote. The problem is you also had nobles and a monarchy, and they were not going to give up their power, and so people didn't support Mazzini's idea for a federal republic in Italy, but he is still considered to be the father of Italian independence and the father of modern Italy. Now, there really are three fathers, and the second father is Garibaldi. Now, Garibaldi was a military leader. He was the leader really starting in 1848. Remember that Sicily had been the ball that got everything going. Remember the ball that's being kicked by the boot of Italy? That was where the revolutions of 1848, the People's Spring, that's where it started. And they wanted freedom and independence. And so, Garibaldi started at that point conquering various parts of southern Italy. He didn't succeed. Eventually, he was forced into exile. He had to go to France, and then he finally went to South America. And in South America, remember Simón Bolívar? Remember all of the revolutions that he had carried out in South America? Well, South America was also known for its guerrilla warfare. That means tactics where soldiers don't fight in big masses. They come out of the bushes and attack. Basically it's stealth, and they have a lot of success because it's chaotic, and armies don't know how to deal with guerrilla warfare, snipers and things like that. So Garibaldi was a master of guerrilla warfare, and eventually he would be able to go back to Italy and would continue to lead rebellions. And his army was called the Red Shirts because they wore red shirts. And this is an idea that you'll see all the way into the 20th century, where groups of people are referred to, the armies are referred to by the color of their shirts. You have the red shirts, you have the black shirts, and you have the brown shirts. Black shirts in Italy later on, when fascism became very popular after World War I. And then you have the brown shirts, who were the Nazis, essentially, in Germany. So Italy wanted to unify, and there were all these conflicts with Austria in the north to try and gain independence. Another man, the third man of the trio, you have Mazzini and Garibaldi, and also Cavour. Cavour was a nobleman, and he was a count. So he had a different status from Garibaldi and Mazzini, but Cavour was the leader in the north, and he was uniting Italy in the north and fighting battles against Austria. And so finally you had Garibaldi, even though he was going to declare himself dictator, he ultimately gave he gave his armies over to Cavour, and Italy was united. This happened in 1866, and it was basically called the Third War for Italian Independence. The first war in 1848, the second in 1859, and the third in 1866 finally pushed it over the edge. And Italy gained its independence. It became the Kingdom of Italy under Victor Emmanuel. That was the name of the king. And then finally you have the independence gained in 1871. So it was about 5 more years before, I should say, total unification in 1871. I want to make sure I talk about the 1866 Austro-Prussian War, which was very significant. Prussia actually was working together with Italy because Austria and Prussia had different ideas of what Germany should look like. Austria believed there should be a big Germany that should include all 39 independent states that were German-speaking. The problem with this was Austria actually included other people groups that were totally different from Germans. And so in Prussia, they wanted a smaller Germany, and so basically they didn't want to include Austria in their idea of Germany. And Austria was still quite powerful, and so Prussia wanted to balance out that power, and so they attacked, I should probably do this, Prussia attacking Austria, or supporting Italy in attacking Austria during the during the War of Independence, and then leading to the Austro-Prussian War. And Prussia won. What was interesting, though, is that Prussia didn't want to make Austria so angry that there could never be an alliance in the future. This is important because even though they were enemies during 1866, eventually Prussia and Austria would form an alliance in the 1880s to balance Russia's power. So you had Prussia and Austria versus Russia. That is a preview of what would happen in World War I. So Prussia's alliance with Italy eventually gained independence for Italy from Austria. It weakened Austria, and it actually led to the beginning of what was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now that makes it sound like Austria is gaining power, but really it was a recognition that there are two parts of Austria. There's Austria and there's Hungary, which was totally different and was the Slavic people groups of the Balkans that were being controlled by the Austrians. They were not German-speaking, and they were very different. Many of them were Russian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, and so their religion was different, their language was different. So this is the beginning of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but really it's the beginning of the end for the Austro-Hungarian Empire too. At the end of this, we also have, in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, which we'll discuss in a later segment. But just know that the ultimate goal for Germany, for Prussia, was a united Germany under Prussia's leadership, not under Austria's leadership. How did this all happen in Prussia? Well, you need to know that there were two main leaders. One was the king, the Kaiser, the emperor. His name was Wilhelm I. Wilhelm I was the brother of the previous emperor, who was Friedrich Wilhelm IV. Friedrich Wilhelm was older, and he had an illness and became sick, and so he was not able to rule. Instead, William, or Wilhelm I, became the Prince Regent, and that means he was able to rule for his brother. And at first, it seemed like, okay, he was conservative, but he was open. There's an openness to liberal ideas. And because of 1848, a new parliament was established in Germany, and this parliament, it was called the Reichstag, that was a liberal parliament, and so you have a conservative ruler. Basically, it's William I as a prince regent taking care of the kingdom for his living brother who can't rule. And then you have this liberal parliament. So you had conservative ruler and a liberal parliament, and they did not agree on things. So Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm, he had to be careful what he did. And eventually he needed a right-hand man, and his right-hand man was Bismarck. Bismarck became the minister who would help the king or the Kaiser, and Bismarck had an enormous amount of power. And his idea was that it was okay to fight wars to strengthen Prussia's influence. And he wanted Germany to be united under Kaiser Wilhelm. And so he had many plans. When I say that he approved of wars as a way to grow Prussian or German influence, that didn't mean he was stupid. He also knew it was wrong to attack at the wrong time, and it was a bad idea to make a total enemy out of Austria. So he always wanted to maintain balance. That's the end of this segment, and I hope it sets up what is coming, and I hope you can understand that Germany is rising as a united nation, and Italy is kind of coming together too. Let's talk quickly now about the family that led Germany through its unification and on toward World War I. And these are the Kaisers. Remember that Kaiser is basically a German word meaning Caesar. And you may remember that Tsar also means Caesar. So Kaiser, Tsar, and Caesar essentially mean the absolute ruler of a kingdom. And so Kaiser Wilhelm I was the first Kaiser. He was the first one who ruled a unified Germany. And you know that he struggled with his own parliament, and there was a little bit of shared authority, but ultimately the parliament wasn't able to run the country. It was Kaiser Wilhelm's will, and then his right-hand minister, who didn't have to answer to parliament, but had to answer to the Kaiser. So those two, Wilhelm I and Bismarck, ran the country. Well, Wilhelm, he actually was the target of assassination attempts, just like Alexander II had been in Russia, and it's the same time that Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. So assassination is being used as a political tool from this period forward. And that happened in 1861, I believe, that Kaiser Wilhelm faced an assassination attempt. Then in 1878, he faced 2 more assassination attempts, and he was seriously wounded. In one of them, it was a doctor, meaning basically a PhD doctor, who fired a shotgun at him as his car was passing, and seriously wounded him. He was saved only because of the helmet he was wearing. And so he continued for 10 more years, and then he died. And his son took over, Kaiser Friedrich III. And Kaiser Friedrich III only ruled for a couple of months. And that is important because the year 1888 was seen as the year of 3 Kaisers. So it's Kaiser Wilhelm I, Friedrich III, who died very shortly after, and Kaiser Wilhelm II. So Kaiser Wilhelm II is the grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm I. It's important to know that Friedrich III was actually very well respected. So this is Wilhelm II's father. Kaiser Friedrich III was a man who actually was brilliant in warfare, but didn't want to fight. He was less into militarism, and his people loved him. But he died, and as a result, his son took over, and Kaiser Wilhelm II was not the same kind of ruler. In fact, he was tempestuous. He made decisions without thinking and without consulting his advisors. And as a result, he got Germany into new alliances, specifically with Austria. And we're going to find out how in 1914 that alliance led to Germany being sucked into a war that wasn't even their war. So that's Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he had a very different personality from either his grandfather or his father. Now, this is what's fascinating. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the first cousin of George V of England. And so Kaiser Wilhelm II was the grandson of Queen Victoria. That's just amazing in our day and age. It would be like, the president of Germany being the grandson of George W. Bush or something like that. So they were cousins, and they were also cousins with Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia. And we've mentioned this before, how there was this interconnectedness among the royalty, and that also would lead not only to alliances, but also to crazy conflicts. Now, in all of this, Prussia is gaining strength, and now is Germany. And Germany's power through its militarism would be leading toward a tipping point that no one could ignore. So we're going to back up just a little bit. In 1871 was the unification of Germany, but 1870 was the Franco-Prussian War. And we've already talked about the Austro-Prussian War. We've talked about the conflicts between Austria and Italy. But this one was between Prussia and France. The Franco-Prussian War was decisive. France had been a force with Napoleon, but had been stopped. But since then, there was a new government, a republic. And the elected president, the first elected president of France, was Napoleon III. And he served one term of 4 years, but he could not run for another term. He could not serve another term. And so instead, he crowned himself emperor. And we started the whole process all over again in France of having a Napoleon-like emperor taking the throne and being aggressive and trying to expand France's influence. And so he was an emperor, Emperor Napoleon III, and he also spread his influence around the world and was trying to get new colonies for France. France had already gone into Africa and had established colonies in places like Algeria and had definitely been a force in Egypt. But Napoleon III wanted to go to Southeast Asia, and that means the area that we call Vietnam today. It was Indochina, between India and China, I guess you could think of it, or between Indonesia and China, really. And so what happened was Napoleon III sent Navy ships to that area and started bombarding Tonkin, which was the northern part of Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin is very famous from the Vietnam War. You'll hear that in our next series of videos next year. But the main thing is that you need to know that the French were defending Catholics who were in Vietnam. So there were Catholic missionaries, and as a result, Napoleon III wanted to extend France's influence in Vietnam. This would be very important because eventually it would be called French Indochina, and France's influence in Vietnam would be felt all the way through the 20th century. So that is the story of how the Franco-Prussian War then was between Prussia and France. And what happened was France was no match for Prussia. Prussia was a dominant military at this point. Now, what was that war really about? It was about influence in Europe, but specifically it was about one little slice of land called Alsace-Lorraine. And it also includes an area called the Saar. Now, this is the Rhineland. This is the area in Germany today, but basically it was a boundary between Germany and France. And so both countries wanted this area, and France wanted to push its borders all the way up to the Rhine River. But Germany did not want that. In the past, Germans had been scared of France because of Napoleon and his armies, but now the Germans had the advantage, and they basically forced France at the end of this Franco-Prussian War of 1870. They forced France to give back or to give over Alsace and Lorraine. This would be one of the main problems in World War I and all the way through World War II. So in some ways, we could say that the Franco-Prussian War was fought over Alsace-Lorraine. And there were other places where European countries were fighting over territories and the resources that were in those territories, specifically in Southeast Asia and places like the Philippines, Indonesia, all those little islands, but also in Africa. Africa was seen as an uncharted territory, a place where colonies could be founded. And with the invention of quinine, malaria was not killing as many people. It was a drug that could be taken, and it didn't get rid of malaria, but it lessened the effects of malaria. And so in 1884 and 1885, there was a conference called the Berlin Conference. You could also call it the Congo Conference, because it had to do with the Congo, the center of Africa, but also all of Africa, and how it would be managed and how it would be taken over by Europeans. This conference took place in Berlin, and basically Bismarck was the one who managed everything as a master of ceremonies. And no Africans were invited to this conference. So this is connected to some of the readings you'll be doing. You may know of explorers in Africa, namely David Livingstone and also Henry Morgan Stanley. And those two are famous because Livingstone, who was a doctor and a missionary and an explorer, he had gone all throughout Africa, but there was a period where he was not heard from, and his family and everyone in England were worried that he was maybe gone forever. And so Henry Stanley went as a journalist to try and track down Livingstone, and he went all over. And finally, when he found Livingstone, Dr. Livingstone, he said to him, "Livingstone, I presume?" And he stuck out his hand, and that's a famous line in history. Well, Stanley was one of the main people carving out the area called the Congo. And he did this as a part of a humanitarian or philanthropic organization that had been set up by the King of Belgium, King Leopold II. But Stanley then became a representative of Belgium at the Berlin Conference. So there were so many places in Africa that were unknown. We call it terra incognito. That's how it was labeled on maps, unknown land. And so the goal then for Europeans became, we've got to explore and then we can colonize. And the conference basically said it's okay for Europeans to take over all of Africa. So old slavery by this time had been abolished. William Wilberforce and other people around the world had ceased the practice of slavery, but a new slavery took its place. We will talk about that in the next segment. So that brings us to our final installment. And some of the information that I'm going to give you right now it's very disturbing, not just because it happened once in history, but because it continues to happen. There are many powerful people in the world, and there are many powerful countries. And many times those powerful countries forget what it means to have power. And they tend to make other people their slaves in one way or another. A prime example of this happened with the country of Belgium and its king, named King Leopold II. We've already discussed how King Leopold was represented at the Berlin Conference by Henry Morgan Stanley, and something that seemed like it was supposed to help Africans. It was a company that was an organization to provide philanthropy to Africa. Philanthropy means basically loving people, right? And so philanthropy was what they said they were doing, But really, it was all about economics. It was all about power. And so King Leopold II was able to found the Congo Free State. A terrible name, because it wasn't really a state. It was simply a part of Africa controlled fully by King Leopold II. And it certainly wasn't free. It was a new kind of slavery that was happening in this area of Africa, the center of Africa, basically. And it was King Leopold II's private colony. And he was given permission from the rest of the European countries to do so, mainly because they wanted the right to do that with their own colonies. And so they looked the other way, even though he said he was doing good things, and they made him promise that he would take care of people and actually be a part of their education. But the main thing that was happening was slavery and economic domination and the extraction of resources on behalf of King Leopold II himself, but eventually he gave what he had taken to the country of Belgium. And so today we need to know Belgium bears the burden. It bears the responsibility for that curse. So what kind of resources did Congo have? Namely, it was ivory. And ivory was extremely valuable. It was not only inhumane to animals, but it was a process that required slave labor and the building of railroads to get the ivory in and out of the country. That was a terrible thing because those railroads required explosives, and often people would lose their limbs in that activity. They would be chained together as they worked because, otherwise they'd run away. They knew that this was a horrible fate for them. In addition, it wasn't just ivory. In addition, the Belgians under King Leopold II were harvesting rubber. And I should say it wasn't only Belgium. All of the European countries were making off like bandits, basically profiting from the trade of these resources. This became known throughout Europe as the red rubber system. Now, the rubber itself wasn't red. It was called red rubber because it was through people's blood that this rubber was being harvested. Now, why did Belgium and Europeans need rubber? It was because of this modern era. The technology that required rubber belts and rubber tires, it led to this demand for rubber, and the supply came from Congo and other islands in Southeast Asia. And one thing that had to happen too was that the Belgians needed to have allies. King Leopold II needed to have allies. That means native Africans who would help to govern that colony, because there weren't that many Europeans there. It was mostly Africans, and they did this because of tribal conflicts. One tribe that was used as allies was the Zapo-Zaps. Kind of a silly sounding name, and it was really given to a group by Europeans. So we need to recognize that. When you name something, you have power over it. Zapo-Zap was actually the name of one man, the leader, but all the people who followed that leader became known as the Zapo-Zaps. They were the ones who went out and would collect taxes from all the people, all the villages, for the Belgians, and would help them extract the resources. And they also massacred people who would not pay their taxes or couldn't pay their taxes. The red rubber system that I mentioned, you need to know that if people did not get their quota of rubber, they would have hands cut off, they would have other body parts cut off. And so it was a very terrible thing. And so the story that I want to share with you is sometimes called the Cuba Massacre. And it is a case where Africans were doing horrible things to Africans, but we need to understand that the reason that this was happening was because of Europeans. This is a case where a minister named William Henry Shepherd decided to investigate the situation in the Congo Free State. And the group of people that were being manipulated and the group that was suffering were called the Cuba people. So people like the Zappo-Zaps were guilty of being the mercenaries, being the ones who were paid to go and extract the resources and then get taxes from people, and they carried out punishments, including cutting off hands and feet and whatever needed to happen. Now, recently, the same kind of thing has been happening, not just in Africa, but there's a prime example, and it's related to blood diamonds. And they're known as blood diamonds because of the blood that is spilled by the ones who are making slaves go and find those diamonds. And so it doesn't matter what resource it is, you always have the powerful exploiting those who are less powerful. Now, finally, Europeans got wise to this. In 1899, there was a minister who went to Africa and was very innocently asking questions and discovered the massacre that had happened. And so gradually Europeans got more involved, and by 1904, Europeans were not going to let Belgium continue their abuses, and they forced King Leopold II to give his colony to the country so that there could be more oversight. What a terrible story, but you need to know that this is part of the buildup. This rush and race and competition for resources around the world was part of what led to the coming war. Thanks for watching.